June 19, 1944. 11:07 a.m. Philippine Sea, approximately 200 nautical miles west of the Mariana Islands. Commander Herman Kossler stood in the cramped control room of USS Cavalla, his submarine at periscope depth in waters that had become a graveyard for better men than him, and watched through the narrow lens as the largest concentration of Japanese naval power since Midway steamed directly into his firing solution. For aircraft carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Chitose, and Hayo, moving in formation with their destroyer escorts, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch, representing decades of Japanese naval investment and thousands of trained personnel. They had no idea that death was watching them from 60 feet below the surface, that a single American submarine was about to accomplish what entire air wings had failed to do, that in the next 20 minutes the balance of naval power in the Pacific would shift irreversibly. Kossler's hands were steady as he called out bearings and distances to his fire control team, his voice calm despite knowing that what he was about to attempt had never been successfully achieved in the history of submarine warfare, for capital ships destroyed in a single engagement, for massive floating cities of steel and flesh sent to the bottom before their crews could even understand what was happening. This is the story of the most devastating submarine attack in history, 20 minutes that changed the Pacific War, and the men who turned mathematics and courage into the greatest submarine victory ever recorded. To understand what happened in those 20 minutes, you must first understand the weapon that made it possible and the war that had brought it to this moment. USS Cavalla was a Gato-class submarine, one of the workhorses of the American submarine force in World War II, 311 feet long, displacing 1,525 tons surfaced, capable of diving to 300 feet though her crew had taken her deeper when necessary. She carried 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, and a crew of 80 men who lived in conditions that would break most people, spending months at a time submerged in a steel tube where privacy didn't exist, where the air smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, where every sound had to be monitored because Japanese destroyers hunted with sonar that could detect a dropped wrench from miles away. Herman Kossler was 32 years old that June, a submarine commander on his first war patrol, which meant he was simultaneously inexperienced and hungry to prove himself. He'd trained for years, studied every aspect of submarine warfare, practiced attack runs until he could calculate firing solutions in his sleep. But training and actual combat were different universes, and Kossler knew that his crew was watching him, judging whether their new captain had the nerve and skill to bring them through combat alive. The weight of command sat heavily on his shoulders, 80 men whose survival depended on his decisions, whose families would receive telegrams if he made the wrong call, whose lives were his responsibility every second of every day. Cavalla had departed Pearl Harbor on May 31, 1944, assigned to patrol areas off the Philippines and Marianas where American intelligence believed the Japanese combined fleet would appear to contest the American invasion of Saipan. The intelligence was correct. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had assembled the largest Japanese naval force since Midway, intending to destroy the American invasion fleet in what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, or to American pilots who slaughtered Japanese aircraft by the hundreds, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But on the morning of June 19, the air battle that would make history hadn't yet begun. Cavalla was running submerged, conserving battery power, listening on sonar for contacts, when at 1030 hours the sonarman reported multiple contacts. Bearing northeast, high-speed screws indicating large warships. Kossler had immediately gone to periscope depth, raised the scope for quick looks, 15 seconds maximum to avoid detection, and felt his heart accelerate as he identified the contacts. Aircraft carriers. Multiple carriers. Moving in formation with what looked like at least 20 escort vessels. This was the main Japanese carrier force, the heart of their naval aviation capability, steaming directly toward Cavalla's position. It was simultaneously the greatest opportunity any submarine commander could hope for and the most dangerous tactical situation imaginable. Carriers were the most heavily defended ships in any fleet, surrounded by destroyers whose sole purpose was to detect and destroy submarines, protected by layers of sonar and lookouts and aircraft that could spot a periscope wake from thousands of feet up. Kossler had seconds to make his decision. He could attack, attempt to penetrate the destroyer screen and get firing solutions on the carriers, possibly achieving the kind of success that would make him legendary but more likely getting depth charged to pieces by the escorts. Or he could stay deep, let the formation pass, and report their position to American command, safer, more prudent, the kind of decision that kept submarines and crews alive but didn't win wars or earn medals. He chose to attack. Later, when historians analyzed his decision, they would debate whether it was courage or recklessness, brilliant tactical thinking or dangerous overconfidence. But in that moment, Kossler simply saw targets that represented years of Japanese naval construction, thousands of enemy personnel, and the naval aviation capability that had attacked Pearl Harbor and threatened American operations across the Pacific. He saw a chance to change the war, and he took it. "Battle stations torpedo," he ordered, his voice carrying through the submarine's communication system. The crew had drilled this moment hundreds of times, knew their positions and responsibilities instinctively. Men moved through the cramped passages with practiced efficiency, taking stations at the torpedo tubes, the fire control computers, the diving planes, the engineering spaces. The submarine's atmosphere shifted from routine to combat in seconds, tension replacing boredom, fear mixing with adrenaline and professional focus. Kossler raised the periscope again, taking bearing and range measurements, calling them out to Lieutenant Robert Thompson at the torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog device that calculated firing solutions based on target bearing, range, speed, and course. The mathematics of submarine torpedo attacks were complex. Torpedoes traveled much slower than their targets, requiring the submarine to fire not at where the target was but where it would be when the torpedo arrived, accounting for the torpedo's run time, the target's speed and course, and dozens of other variables. Bearing mark. Range 4,000 yards. Target speed estimated 20 knots, course 270, Kossler called out, his eye pressed to the periscope as he tracked the lead carrier. It was Shokaku, he was almost certain, one of the carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, a veteran ship with a veteran crew. Behind her came Zuikaku, another Pearl Harbor veteran, then Chitose and Hayo, smaller carriers but still formidable targets. They were steaming in a box formation, protected by a ring of destroyers that were executing anti-submarine patterns, zigging and zagging, their sonar actively pinging the water, searching for threats. "Solution ready," Thompson reported, his hands steady on the TDC controls despite the sweat running down his face. The temperature in the submarine had climbed with the crew at battle stations, bodies generating heat in an enclosed space with no ventilation while submerged. Kossler made his calculations. At 4,000 yards, he was too far for a reliable shot. The Mark 14 torpedoes were effective to about 3,000 yards against a maneuvering target. He needed to get closer, which meant penetrating deeper into the destroyer screen, increasing the risk exponentially. Every 100 yards closer made the shot more likely to hit but also made detection more likely, and if those destroyers got a solid sonar contact on Cavalla, they would prosecute with depth charges until the submarine was destroyed or forced to surface and surrender. All ahead 1/3. Make your depth 60 feet. Bring me to course 310, Kossler ordered, maneuvering Cavalla to close the distance while staying deep enough to avoid visual detection but shallow enough to shoot. The submarine turned slowly, her electric motors driving her through the water at minimal speed to reduce cavitation noise that sonar could detect. The tension in the control room was physical, something you could feel pressing against your chest. Men who'd been joking and playing cards 20 minutes earlier were now silent, focused, aware that they were minutes away from either the greatest success of their lives or deaths in the crushing depth of the Pacific. The only sounds were the hum of the electric motors, the quiet pinging of the sonar, and Kossler's calm voice as he issued orders and made observations. At 1,055 hours, Cavalla reached her attack position. Range to the lead carrier was now 2,800 yards and closing. The destroyer screen had passed on either side of the submarine's position without detecting her. Luck, skill, and the fact that Japanese sonar was inferior to American equipment. Kossler had a perfect firing solution on not just one but all four carriers in sequence. They were beautifully lined up, following standard tactical doctrine that made them easy to track but also put them all within range of a single submarine with enough torpedoes. Make ready tubes. 1 through 6. Set depth 10 feet. Spread shot, 1 degree offset. Kossler was loading all 6 forward tubes, planning a spread shot that would send torpedoes in a slight fan pattern, increasing the probability of hits even if his solution wasn't perfect. The Mark 14 torpedoes each carried 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, enough to blow a hole in any ship's hull below the waterline, dooming it to slow flooding or catastrophic explosion if the warhead struck near magazines or fuel bunkers. Tubes 1 through 6 ready in all respects, the torpedo officer reported from the forward torpedo room. Kossler took one final look through the periscope. The lead carrier filled his vision, a massive gray wall of steel moving through the water with deceptive grace. He could see aircraft on the flight deck, could see crew members moving around, completely unaware that death was seconds away. For a moment, he thought about the men on that ship, thousands of them, sailors and pilots and mechanics and cooks, men who had families and dreams and no idea they were about to die. Then he pushed the thought away. This was war. Those carriers represented the enemy's ability to project power, to attack American forces, to extend the war and cost American lives. Sinking them was his duty, regardless of the human cost. Bearing mark. Firing point procedures. Match generated bearing. Matched. Thompson confirmed from the TDC. Fire 1. Kossler's voice was steady, command absolute. Cavalla shuddered slightly as compressed air expelled the first torpedo from Tube 1, the weapon accelerating out of the submarine and beginning its run toward Shokaku. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. The commands came at 3-second intervals, each torpedo launching with the same slight shudder, Cavalla losing thousands of pounds of weight with each shot, the submarine becoming more positively buoyant, requiring the diving officer to compensate by flooding tanks to maintain depth. All tubes fired electrically, the torpedo officer confirmed. Reloading forward tubes. Now came the longest part of submarine warfare, the wait. The torpedoes were running at 46 knots, covering roughly 75 feet per second. At 2,800 yards, they'd need approximately 2 minutes to reach their targets, 2 minutes during which anything could happen. The carriers could turn, the destroyers could detect the torpedo wakes and warn their charges, the torpedoes themselves could malfunction. The Mark 14 had a notorious history of depth-keeping problems and premature or failed detonations. Kossler didn't lower the periscope. He kept it up, watching, tracking the torpedo's expected run times, counting seconds, waiting for the impacts or the telltale signs that his attack had been detected. Japanese lookouts were scanning the water, but the sea state was moderate with small swells, enough to hide periscope wakes and torpedo tracks unless someone was looking at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. At 1,057 hours and 14 seconds, the first torpedo struck Shokaku amidships on her port side. Through the periscope, Kossler saw the explosion, a column of water and debris shooting up from the carrier's waterline, the ship's massive hull shuddering from the impact, a fireball visible for an instant before being obscured by the water column collapsing back. 2 seconds later, the second torpedo hit further aft. Then the third torpedo, and before the Japanese crew could even begin damage control procedures, the fourth and fifth torpedoes struck in rapid succession. 5 hits on a single carrier. It was unprecedented, a demonstration of perfect fire control and either tremendous luck or skill. Shokaku immediately began listing to port, her engine rooms flooding, her speed dropping as damage overwhelmed her pumps. Kossler watched men scrambling on her deck, saw aircraft sliding toward the listing side, witnessed organized chaos as a veteran crew tried to save their ship. But he couldn't watch for long. The sixth torpedo had missed Shokaku, continuing its run toward the second carrier in formation. And Kossler was already swinging the periscope to acquire the next target, already calling out new bearings and ranges to Thompson at the TDC, already preparing to fire his aft tubes at the remaining carriers. Con, Sonar. Destroyers breaking formation, turning toward us. High-speed screws bearing 090 and 270. The escorts had detected something, maybe the torpedo wakes, maybe the periscope, maybe just the fact that Shokaku was clearly under attack and the threat had to be nearby. 2 destroyers were charging toward Cavalla's position, and if they got close enough to drop depth charges, the submarine would be in mortal danger. Make ready tubes 7 through 10. Target bearing 285, range 3200 yards. Stand by to fire aft tubes and then take her deep. Make your depth 250 feet on my mark. Kossler was racing the destroyers, trying to get off shots at the remaining carriers before being forced to dive deep and evade. The second carrier, Zuikaku, was in his sights now, also maintaining course because her captain hadn't yet understood that his own ship was threatened, too focused on the disaster unfolding aboard Shokaku. Fire 7. Fire 8. Fire 9. Fire 10. The aft tubes fired in rapid succession, for more torpedoes in the water, running towards Zuikaku and potentially the carriers behind her. Kossler had committed all 10 of his immediately available torpedoes, the other 14 were stored and would take time to reload into the tubes, time he wouldn't have with destroyers closing fast. Take her deep. Full dive on the planes. All ahead full. Come to course 180. Cavalla's nose tilted down sharply as the diving officer pushed the planes to maximum angle, the submarine accelerating downward, seeking the safety of depth. Around them, the water began filling with the distinctive sound of destroyer propellers, high-pitched, rapidly churning, getting louder and closer. Then came the first depth charges, the sharp crack boom of high-explosive detonating underwater, sending shock waves through the ocean that hit Cavalla like physical blows. The lights went out. Emergency lighting came on, bathing everything in red. Men grabbed onto anything bolted down as the submarine shook from near-miss explosions. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. A pipe cracked somewhere aft, spraying seawater under high pressure. The depth gauge spun toward 250 feet, then passed it as Cavalla's momentum carried her deeper than ordered. Level off! Level off! The diving officer shouted, fighting the planes, blowing ballast to check their descent before they went too deep and crushed hull pressure exceeded safety limits. More depth charges rained down, the destroyers prosecuting their contact with systematic thoroughness, working in a pattern designed to blanket the area with explosions. Each detonation was a hammer blow against Cavalla's hull, testing welds and seams, threatening to crack the pressure hull or damage vital systems. Men prayed or cursed or simply held on, their fate entirely out of their hands, dependent on whether the Japanese had guessed correctly where the submarine was and whether Cavalla's hull could withstand the punishment. But then, through the chaos of the depth charge attack, a new sound penetrated, explosions that were different, larger, with a different acoustic signature. Torpedo hits. The torpedoes from the aft tubes were reaching their targets. Kossler couldn't see what was happening above, he was too deep, too busy evading destruction, but the sonarman was tracking secondary explosions, massive detonations that could only be magazines or fuel bunkers going up aboard the carriers. American submarines would later receive confirmation from radio intercepts and reconnaissance aircraft that Zuikaku had taken 3 torpedo hits, Chitose had taken 2, and Hayo had taken 1 massive hit that had detonated near her forward magazine, literally blowing her bow off. 4 carriers hit. All 4 severely damaged. And Cavalla was still alive, still diving, still evading the destroyer attacks that were becoming less coordinated as the Japanese escorts faced the terrible choice of continuing to hunt the submarine or breaking off to assist their dying carriers. The depth charging continued for another 40 minutes, gradually moving away as Cavalla's evasive maneuvers and silent running made her impossible to hold contact on. Kossler took the submarine down to 350 feet, deeper than safe operating depth but necessary to break contact, the hull creaking and groaning under the pressure, every man aboard aware that the steel around them was stressed to its limits. When the attacks finally ceased, when the destroyer screws faded to silence and the sonar no longer detected active pings, Kossler ordered Cavalla to shallow depth. They needed to assess damage, recharge batteries, and if possible, confirm what they'd accomplished. The submarine was hurt but functional. The depth charging had caused leaks, damaged some non-critical systems, and traumatized the crew, but the pressure hull held, the engines worked, and the torpedoes remained intact. They'd survived. At 1,430 hours, Kossler risked raising the periscope. What he saw confirmed the magnitude of what Cavalla had accomplished. Two of the carriers he'd attacked were clearly visible, both listing heavily, both surrounded by escorts and smaller vessels attempting rescue operations. One appeared to be on fire, thick black smoke rising from her hull. The other was so low in the water that her flight deck was nearly awash. American reconnaissance aircraft would later confirm what Kossler could only partially observe. Shokaku, hit by 5 torpedoes, had sunk at 1,501 hours after massive flooding and uncontrollable fires. Suikoku, hit by 3 torpedoes, would survive this attack but was so badly damaged that she'd return to Japan for repairs and would be sunk 4 months later. Chitose, hit by 2 torpedoes, had sustained critical damage that would eventually lead to her sinking during the later phases of the battle. And Hayo, hit by a single torpedo that struck her forward magazine, had suffered catastrophic damage and would sink by nightfall. In 20 minutes of attacks, from 10:57 when the first torpedo hit to 11:17 when the last torpedo found its target, USS Cavalla had accomplished what entire air wing struggled to achieve. 4 fleet carriers hit, 2 sunk immediately, 1 mortally wounded, 1 so damaged she was removed from combat operations for months. Thousands of Japanese sailors died. Decades of naval construction and pilot training were erased. The balance of carrier power in the Pacific shifted irreversibly in America's favor. The cost in human terms was staggering. Shokaku alone carried a crew of over 1,600 men, plus her air wing of several hundred pilots and aircrew. When she went down, she took most of those men with her, trapped below decks as flooding overwhelmed watertight integrity, or unable to escape the oil-covered burning water around the sinking ship. The same tragedy played out aboard Hayo and the other damaged carriers. Men burned, drowned, were trapped in flooding compartments or died from injuries sustained in the explosions. Japanese destroyers rescued hundreds but couldn't save everyone. Bodies floated in the water for days afterward, a grim testament to the human cost of modern naval warfare. Aboard Cavalla, the crew processed what they'd done with mixed emotions. There was pride, they'd accomplished the greatest submarine attack in history, destroyed major enemy combatants, contributed decisively to American naval superiority. There was relief, they'd survived an experience that killed most submarines that attempted attacks on carrier task forces. But there was also a quiet horror at the scale of death they'd caused, at the thousands of enemy sailors who died from their torpedoes, at the realization that modern warfare allowed small groups of men to inflict industrial-scale casualties with almost clinical efficiency. Kossler wrote in his patrol report, in the careful understated language of official military documents, that Cavalla had engaged enemy carrier task force and achieved hits on multiple targets. He noted the depth charging and evasion tactics, the damage sustained and repairs needed, the remaining torpedo inventory and fuel status. He made recommendations for improved torpedo performance and suggested modifications to attack procedures based on lessons learned. But what he didn't write, what couldn't be captured in official reports, was what it felt like to watch through a periscope as ships sank and men died, to give orders that killed thousands, to bear the moral weight of being so devastatingly effective at dealing death. Submarine commanders in World War II had the highest responsibility to casualty ratio of perhaps any combatants in history. Small crews of 80 men could sink ships carrying thousands, could destroy cities' worth of material with a few well-placed torpedoes, could change the strategic balance of entire campaigns through a few minutes of combat. The ethical complexity of submarine warfare troubled some commanders, Kossler among them. In interviews after the war, he spoke carefully about June 19, 1944, acknowledging pride in his crew's performance while expressing regret for the necessity of what they'd done. "We didn't hate the Japanese sailors we killed," he said in a 1972 interview. "They were doing their duty, same as us. But war doesn't allow for nuance or moral hesitation. You see the enemy, you attack. You do your job. You try not to think too much about the human consequences. Cavalla would continue her patrol, eventually returning to Pearl Harbor in July 1944 to a hero's welcome. The crew received numerous commendations. Kossler was awarded the Navy Cross for his command performance. The submarine herself was celebrated in newspapers and newsreels, became part of the legend of American submarine warfare, was used in recruiting materials and war bond drives as an example of American technical and tactical superiority. But the men who'd been there, who'd lived through those 20 minutes of combat and 40 minutes of depth charging, who'd heard the explosions and felt the hull stress and watched through periscopes as ships sank and men died, they carried more complex memories. They'd done their duty and done it superbly. They'd contributed to victory and shortened the war. But they'd also participated in one of the most lethal naval engagements in history, had been instruments of industrial killing, had exercised power that exceeded anything their grandfathers could have imagined. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued after Cavalla's attack, becoming the decisive American victory that broke Japanese naval aviation permanently. American carrier aircraft destroyed hundreds of Japanese planes in air-to-air combat while losing only a handful of their own, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as pilots called it. Combined with Cavalla's carrier kills, the battle effectively ended the Japanese carrier fleet as a fighting force. Japan would never again mount a major carrier operation, never again seriously threaten American naval superiority in the Pacific. Herman Kossler survived the war, continued his naval career, eventually retired as a rear admiral. He lived to see submarines evolve from the diesel-electric boats he'd commanded to nuclear-powered vessels that could stay submerged for months, carrying ballistic missiles with destructive power that made his torpedo attacks look like firecrackers by comparison. He witnessed the Cold War, watched as submarine warfare evolved into games of cat and mouse between Soviet and American boats. Saw the submarine service transform from a small specialized branch into a critical component of nuclear deterrence. He died in 1993, 81 years old, having lived through the transformation of submarine warfare from crude submersibles to the most sophisticated naval weapons ever created. His obituary mentioned his Navy Cross, his command of Cavalla, the 4 carriers sunk in 20 minutes. But it didn't capture the weight of command, the burden of being responsible for thousands of deaths, the moral complexity of being so good at your job that you changed history. The wreck of Shokaku lies at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, approximately 200 nautical miles west of the Marianas, in water over 4 kilometers deep. She's never been located by salvage expeditions, remains undisturbed, a war grave containing the bodies of over 1,000 Japanese sailors who went down with their ship. Somewhere nearby lie the wrecks of Hayo and possibly other vessels sunk during that engagement. The ocean keeps their secrets, preserves their memory, marks the spot where Herman Kossler and 80 American submariners changed the course of the Pacific War. As the sun set over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, the water was covered with debris and oil and bodies, the scattered remnants of ships that had ruled the Pacific for 3 years but were now broken and sinking. American submarines like Cavalla prowled the depths, deadly and nearly invisible, instruments of a new kind of naval warfare that favored stealth over size, precision over firepower, small crews over massive battleships. The age of the battleship was ending. The age of the aircraft carrier was peaking and would soon begin its own decline toward obsolescence. And the submarine, once considered a minor support weapon, had proven itself capable of accomplishing what entire battle fleets couldn't, sinking 4 carriers in 20 minutes, changing the war's trajectory through courage, skill, and the brutal mathematics of modern combat. History would remember that day as America's great carrier victory, as the battle where Japanese naval aviation died. But deep beneath the waves, in the darkness where submarines lived and fought, Herman Kossler and USS Cavalla had written a different chapter, one where 80 men in a steel tube accomplished what no one thought possible, where a single submarine changed everything, where 20 minutes of perfection in the most dangerous profession imaginable created a victory that echoed across decades and proved that in modern war, the smallest forces could achieve the greatest effects if they possessed skill, courage, and the will to strike when opportunity presented itself.